Thank you, Jen. It's nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, please know our external speakers this evening do not speak on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Dearborn and Dearborn Heights, and the views expressed at this educational event are not necessarily aligned with those of the League of Women Voters. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Aubrey Sargent, Division Chief, Criminal Investigations Division in the Department of the Michigan Attorney General, and our other speakers. But first, just a note about Aubrey. He attended our annual meeting in June, and he had so much fun, he wanted to come back and speak to us again on the important and timely topic of voter misinformation. And also with Aubrey this evening is FBI Special Agent Emily Bergman and FBI Intelligence Analyst Nishan Stiller. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for allowing me to come out and talk about our democracy. The Attorney General's office is adamant about how to protect our democracy in this day and age. So I'll tell you, I in my position, I feel a lot of threats, a lot of misinformation, and I have to vet those threats out, and I send those out. And I oversee 60 special agents, and what we do at the Attorney General's office is we look at the threats. A lot of them deal with mental illness. And we have to understand that because somebody is struggling with mental illness does not necessarily mean they need to be locked up in prison, right? And so we're sensitive to that as well. But there are also people that are of sound mind and continue to send out threats and try to intimidate voters and not allowing them to voice their God-given right to vote. And so I'll talk about a few things that the Attorney General office does. Some of the things that we do for elections to get ready, we address law enforcement as a whole in the entire state, and we put out a law enforcement letter. That letter goes out to every agency in the state, and we talk about best practices, what they should do, how they should address those practices, and different things that may come up. We also have, we put out fillers for different questions. So we set up a 1-800 tip line, and that line goes from October until after the election, and that line is answered by our phone analysts. During the election, the actual election, we have agents and attorneys that are staffing that phone, and so if you have questions for them, they can answer those right there. And we have a lot of law enforcement that call that number as well. But I also will talk about voter intimidation. There's a lot of ways that people attempt to intimidate our voters. And some of them are open carry. You know, a lot of people seem to feel larger if they have a gun, right? They come to different polling places. They also stand out, and I'll tell you, the law is they have to be 100 feet away from a polling place, right? And then the typical open carry is still prohibited at churches and schools. And so anybody that is at a school or a church or a place of worship, they're in violation. You know, that's whether you have a CPL or open carry. And the only exception to that is if you have the express permission from the owner of a church or a school or the person that runs that. And typically that's done by a principal or a priest or pastor. And what they do is they hire security because they don't necessarily know they need protection, you know, so. Those are the two exceptions to open carry. The exception to CPL is to
What is
have.
CPL?
CPL is concealed permit. All right, and so I'll tell you, the exception to that is you have to have permission and you already have a license to carry, so. And I'll just go into brandishing a firearm. Anybody that brandish a firearm during an election or during regular time, it's a crime. It's felonious assault. So, you know, it doesn't matter if you are defending your right to have somebody elected president. If you brandish your weapon, that's a crime, all right? And that's law enforcement. If you are brandishing your weapon to a innocent person, that's a crime.
And that means what? Just holding it out?
No, that's actually, you know, pointing it toward
Okay.
or directing toward, you know? You can have it in your waistband and say, hey, look what I got, right? So that's a crime.
Okay.
Yeah, if they feel threatened, that's a crime. So I'll go into voter intimidation when it comes to somebody standing 100 feet away from the entrance of a voting place, a polling place. A lot of times you'll see, and I know we had this in the past election where they were standing 100 feet away, but they also had camouflage gear on with a rifle over the shoulder, you know, and some voters are intimidated by that, and you shouldn't, right? And so when that happens, you need to call 911 and have law enforcement come out, all right? Disturbing the peace. Anytime that there's an election going on and somebody gets loud and cause a ruckus, then that's disorderly conduct and you need to call law enforcement. And I'll tell you, anytime you're at a polling place and you're distracted from what you're doing, voting, or you're working, that can be a disorderly conduct. Call your local law enforcement, your county sheriff, or your state police, all right? And I would say that should always be the angle that you take. Anytime there's a problem at a polling place, call your local law enforcement, all right? And I know that there's some people that don't actually trust their law enforcement, you know, depending on what city you're at, what county you're in, you know, if that's the case, we have a tip line that we set up for elections. And I would ask that you call that, all right? And I get all of the tips, so I kind of vet them out, and then we have agents that go out to those polling places and take statements, all right? So, and I'll tell you, this is the tip line that we have. It's gonna be 517-335-0800. And that tip line is up and operating as of October 15th, which was a few days ago, and until the end of the election. All right.
Repeat the number, please.
It's gonna be 517
Do you have a handout card for that?
I will, I'll pass those out for you.
Okay.
All right, 517-335-0800.
Thank you.
Mhm. So I'll also address body-worn cameras for law enforcement.
What?
What those are cameras that law enforcement has when they come into, let's say, a police run, right? That camera is activated. Well, for criminal purposes, it is illegal for you to record anybody voting. So let's say they get a run to a polling place, right? Somebody is causing a disturbance. Law enforcement comes in, their body-worn cameras on. They have to take precaution to make sure that they're not recording somebody in a polling place, right? So we have to be careful about that. And so those are some of the rules that law enforcement has to be aware of. And then, again, I would talk about the distance of 100 feet away from a polling place. Anytime that there are poll watchers that come out, they still have to be 100 feet away from the polling place. You know, they can tell you that they work for the federal government, doesn't matter. They have to be 100 feet away from the polling place. All right?
You said poll worker, did you mean poll watcher?
We have poll watchers, I'm sorry, poll watchers, yes.
But if you're, okay, because people can go into the voting.
They absolutely can, right, but you can't stand around to intimidate or watch somebody, yes, so. All right. I'll turn it over to Nishan Spiller.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Good, thank you. So again, my name is Nishan Spiller, and I am an intelligence analyst with FBI Detroit. I am one of two or three election crime coordinators with the FBI. And what I'd like to do this evening is to just give you a little bit of information about the Election Crimes Coordinator, or ECC, program we have. So later on this evening, my colleague Emily is going to come up and give you some additional information. So the FBI has a long-standing history addressing election complaints beginning as early as the 1970s. But today, the FBI's Criminal Intelligence Division, the Election Crimes Coordinator program, we lead federal election security. We do have three key focuses, the first being federal election crimes, and I'll talk about a few of those in a moment, election security collaboration, and the Threats to Election Workers Task Force, which Emily will talk about in a few. So when we talk about election security collaboration, we talk about our relationship with local, state, and other federal agencies in terms of election security. Some of those partners include the Michigan State Police, the Michigan Attorney General's offices, all of the local localities and police departments throughout the state, and other federal agencies such as the Postal, Department of State. Within the FBI, we also have a lot of collaboration across various programs. So the Election Crimes Coordinator program falls under public corruption and civil rights units in the FBI. We also collaborate with our cyber divisions, as well as our counterintelligence divisions and our counter-terrorist divisions. And this is in response to activity that's been observed across the United States throughout election cycles dealing with those threats. And so in response to that activity, we now collaborate. There is not a siloed approach where you just have the public corruption or civil rights unit just dealing with elections unilaterally. We have a cross-programmatic approach to addressing elections. So what that means is during the election time, you have us come out with the Attorney General's office, we have training exercises, we have command posts and other things that we set up to field complaints and things that occur during an election cycle, or if there are threats to election workers, to address those. And Emily's gonna talk about that a little bit later as well. Are there any questions about the election security collaboration part of the ECC program? All right, great. So next I want to talk to you a little bit about federal election crimes. Aubrey did a really good job of telling you what their focus is in terms of that immediate response to things that may occur at a polling location. But the FBI does have some interest in election violations as well. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the three categories, so to speak, of federal violations for election crimes. The first is voter and ballot fraud. And so some of that activity may be where you'll see someone registering to vote multiple times or attempting to cast multiple ballots. Voter and ballot fraud could also include paying someone to vote a certain way. Yeah. Civil rights violations would include things that the state also has interest in, voter intimidation. And this could be any conduct that makes someone feel that they don't have a right to vote and they then withhold their vote. Civil rights violations also include false or disinformation about the time, place, and manner at which a vote should be cast. So that would be something like saying, oh, hello everyone in the Hispanic community. Today, we're gonna have all of you guys vote on Monday instead of Election Tuesday. If you're gearing that misinformation or disinformation towards a certain population, that could potentially fall under the civil rights program and be a violation. The final category for federal election laws that we have interest in is campaign finance. And so some of the activity where you may see under this violation is excessive use or misuse of campaign funds, putting funds into, using funds for things that they're not authorized to be used for. You may also see campaign contributions coming in from prohibited sources, such as foreign nationals or things of that nature, geared to influence policy in the United States. Next, I'm gonna have Emily come up, unless there are any questions about the federal violations. I'm gonna have Emily come up and talk about the threats to election workers task force that we have, as well as FBI's non-interference policy.
Hi everyone, like Nishan said, my name is Emily Bergman. I'm a special agent. I sit on the Detroit Public Corruption and Civil Rights squad with Nishan, and I'm actually the backup. Our primary election crimes coordinator couldn't be here tonight, but that's Kaylee Barker. So the three of us work together. I'll start with a couple of key questions I get asked a lot. I am actually old enough to vote, and my parents did not have to sign a form for me to attend the academy. I've actually worked in the election crimes for the last couple of years. I was in Tennessee before this, and Michigan's been a very interesting case study of its own. So I'll start, we're gonna tag team off with Nishan. So as the FBI, we must abide by the DOJ's non-interference policy. So what this says is it prohibits us from any overt or obvious, visible investigative action until voting has ceased and those results have been certified. This means that as the FBI, we can't show up in our official capacity at a polling location until that location, again, has been closed and the vote has been certified. The only exceptions to this would be some sort of major critical incident, maybe a bombing or a shooting or something like that, where the polling location is now inoperable. In a case like that, we would be able to kind of surge our resources through there. So if there were any issues at a polling location, it's always going to be best to call your locals and your state law enforcement. Some things that we can do during the election season are covert actions, and those actions are things like intaking complaints, so receive complaints by phone, through our tip lines, people coming into our office. We're able to intake those and also do some intelligence gathering. So we sit in command posts, things like that. We share information with our local and state, and we're able to process that intelligence, which will be used in cases, and we can move on with that after election has ceased and all of that process has been finished up. So I think like most crimes, there's been a lot of differences. Crimes within the election realm are becoming more complex and more diverse. Some of the things that we deal with, besides just like your ballot fraud, or campaign finance violations, are things like cyber threats that target our critical infrastructure for an influence that seizes or tries to target our kind of democratic processes, and also the increased possibility of politically motivated violent threats. That's what I've worked the majority of, are those violent threats to election workers. So following the 2020 election, we saw a large uptake as law enforcement in threats made to election workers. And that's a pretty inclusive term. That's going to be people who are appointed, elected, volunteer, or are hired to somehow participate in the election process. The task force was started in June of 2021. It's composed of ourselves, various other DOJ programs, and also the U.S. Postal Service. So the goal of this task force is to identify, investigate, and mitigate all those threats to election workers. And these are received in various ways. During the last election, we saw a lot received via text. We've had people leave threatening voicemails. Sometimes you may see something called like doxing, which is where people will find that person's personal information, their address, photos, things like that, and post it online to threaten that person, to make them feel vulnerable, and also to incite violence, by others against that person. So Nishan went over a couple of applicable statutes that we use when we prosecute these cases. Some of them that are specific to this task force and the threats to election workers are threats by interstate commerce, which really just included that threat was made using some medium that crosses state lines. Mailing threatening communications, obscene and harassing telephone calls, and stalking. Do any of you work in the election realm at all, whether it's volunteering? Awesome. Okay, so you guys, this is some tips and information for you. So if you are in a situation, God forbid, you receive a threat or something that makes you feel vulnerable, the best and first thing you should do is call 911. Unlike TV, FBI agents are not first responders, so your state and locals are going to be the first ones to the scene. Once that's been mitigated and you've determined that there's not an immediate threat to life, you should reach out to the local FBI office. So for you, that'll all be Detroit. And that number, you can actually just Google FBI Detroit and our phone number will pop up. And you should ask for the election crimes coordinator. So they should transfer you to myself, Kaylee, who's our primary election crimes coordinator, or probably our boss. So we'll intake your complaint through there. You can also reach out via our national tip line, which is 1-800-CALL-FBI, so CALL-FBI, or you can turn it in at www.tips.fbi.gov, and all of those will be routed to our office. So one of the best things you can do in those situations is to preserve all the evidence. So screenshots, the email, the voicemail, try to save that to the best of your ability. We're looking for usernames, IP addresses, email addresses, anything like that that would be able to help us locate that subject or identify who it is that's making the threat. And one of the questions we get asked a lot is kind of just internet safety tips in general and how we can minimize our footprint online. So short of you being, an Instagram influencer or some sort of internet personality, it's best to keep your social media sites all on private settings. So this means that you're limiting who can friend you, you're really going through and vetting those friends that have requested you. Make sure you know them in person, that you haven't friended them before, that those friends, their sites look very credible, right? Don't share your location. I know this is popular on some of the newer apps, and they will actually show, track you live, and that stuff can be very dangerous. So it's always best to check your settings and make sure that you have location and some of that turned off on your social media. Another thing we've seen a lot is, maybe you've seen this on Facebook, but fun, like question and answer type things or little surveys where people will post their pet's name and where they went to high school, and things like that. And those can be used, that information can be used by bad guys to target you, or kind of used it in a malicious sense. Also, those are commonly your passwords or your password questions, so it's always best to keep all of that off the internet. I'd also recommend every once in a while just to Google your name and see what comes up. Sometimes you'll be surprised what ends up online. I haven't tried this personally, but I know you can go through your Google settings and you can make a formal request to have Google take down some of that information. I know they don't always have possession or ownership of that information, but it's always probably worth a try. And if you were, again, you know, God forbid, to be the victim of like a doxing incident or something where someone's posted your personal information on social media as a threat, collect all of that as evidence, contact your local law enforcement, and then you can reach out to those social media companies and try to get that information removed, so you at least minimize all the eyes that are on that information. So that's all that I have. Are there any questions about any of that? Yes.
If you feel threatened, can you take a picture with your camera of the person threatening you?
You mean like in person, if they were physically threatening you?
Well, let's say you described some situations
Mhm.
where you felt threatened, right? Can you take a picture with your camera of that person?
You mean legally?
You could take a picture in that situation. I mean, it could escalate the situation. So again, the best thing is always going to, I would not put yourself in any further harm. I would just try to get away from the situation and call your local law enforcement.
Okay, I have a second question.
Mm-hmm.
If I call the FBI,
Mhm.
you told us to call you, but if I call, I'm sorry, 911.
Yep.
Okay, will they call you in turn?
Not typically. We do have pretty tight relationships with our locals, so there is a chance that that information will get, you know, to the right place. But I'd say it's always best probably to follow up with your local FBI office in addition to your local law enforcement. We do a really great job sharing information, but that just kind of ensures that, you know for sure that both of those departments will have all of your information.
Okay, thank you.
We did have some questions that people wrote on some index cards as you all were speaking, and this first one here, it might be for all three, but I remembered Nishan actually talking about 3 different areas that the FBI handles, and one was mis and disinformation. And so feel free, anyone who wants to answer this one, but the question is, do you get involved with robocalls that mislead, like wrong election date, or if you have, there'll be a warrant and you'll be arrested. So, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So our office has actually prosecuted a robocall that went out days before the election, and they said that if you show up for a polling place to vote, that you will be arrested. And so we were able to put our resources in place, track that call, and it was out of state in Ohio, and we actually prosecuted that person. So our office does do that. So.
Were they convicted?
So I think they took a plea, but don't quote me on actually what happened. But yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or?
And just in terms of the FBI's response to that, it depends on the timing. And so I think Emily raised a good point to your question about should you also reach out to the FBI? When we're close to the election process that day, those days leading up, we're in constant communication. We are probably sitting in each other's command posts. And so when you make a call to the MSP, it goes direct to Aubrey, and like last election cycle, I'm literally sitting across from him. And so in that instance, that information is being shared with both of us at the same time, the state and the federal agency, and then I'm processing and pushing that information to Emily and Kaylee and the FBI, and we're processing it in our system. Now, if it's not right at the heart of election time, I think what Emily discussed is probably a best practice, or even in general, to just make sure you make those calls to both. But in terms of if we find out that there is a robocall through one of our reporting mechanisms, then we definitely push that information to Aubrey. Like he's speed dialing our phones. We push it right to him to make sure he's aware of it. And then if it's a legitimate robocall, then they do respond that way. So there's constant communication, and that's that collaboration that I kind of talked about, depending on what the threat is and the timing of it. Like if it's close to election, we cannot interfere or take any investigative steps, so we work directly with the partners who can take steps, and they do take those steps.
Okay, so, because that was gonna be a follow-up I had. We have other questions, but so when you talked about, like, to use that example of that robocall with that misinformation or disinformation, would that be something that you and Emily both talked about, the FBI, Department of Justice, not really getting involved in anything that would, I don't know what term you'd use, I can't remember the term you used to describe it.
Non-interference.
Thank you. So the non-interference, but that type of issue of misinformation or disinformation, you would pass along so that if there was action that could be taken by state or local law enforcement, it could be.
Talk to the microphone.
That's correct.
You need to talk through the microphone, you should, because I don't hear what you're saying. And it's probably not hearing the questions.
She's not hearing your question.
So the question was, I know you were talking about the non-interference, like would we be able to do anything if you were to report that robocall? So like we were saying, we do sit, especially just around that election period in particular, we are in each other's offices, in each other's command posts, and we share back and forth, right? So if it's a better fit federally, then we'll receive that information from state and locals. If it's something where we can't take action at that moment or it'd be a better fit for the state, then that's something we'll share with our partners. And between the two of us, we'll collaborate on the best fit for that case at that time.
Thank you. So we do have some other questions. Maybe it would be helpful for the audience to hear if I could use the microphone, and then you can, whoever wants to take them. The question we have is, do you get involved with threats to Michigan U.S. Congresspersons?
So I'll tell you, this is truly a partnership. When we talk about the FBI is our partners. Whenever we get a threat, depending on who it is, or what the threat is, if it's to the Secretary of State, obviously our office would handle that. If it goes to somebody's threatening a congressperson, right? We push that to the FBI. But we also stay connected with that investigation. And because a lot of times these are the same people that they threaten a congressman today, the next day they threaten the AG, right? And so we have to stay connected into the investigation. So I think that's, we're truly a partner.
Our next question is, do you find voter intimidation greater in any particular parts of the country?
I'll let you go first. I don't think we can necessarily speak to what happens or happens across the entire country. We can say definitively that we have seen an increase in intimidation, but where those incidents occur, we haven't actually mapped that to give a fair and accurate answer.
Yeah, I'd say that's the right answer. I will say, I worked in Tennessee before, I kind of mentioned that. So the things that you see will vary from state to state, kind of based on their voter population, kind of which way the state tends to swing. So you will see differences in the kind of violations you work, depending on which state you work in.
How much have the threats increased? And the second part of the question is, how often are there attempts to vote more than once?
Well, the first question, They typically increase closer to the election. And so obviously we spend a lot more resources and manpower investigating those threats. And so, you know, I can't really say how much, but I can tell you we spend a lot of resources in investigating the threats. And the second part was the,
Voting more than once.
I'm sorry?
Multiple voting.
Oh,
And are
okay,
there
okay,
attempts to
yeah.
vote more than
And
once?
so, again, we get all of those from the Department of State. They send those to me. It happens a lot. And I'll tell you, we've probably prosecuted, just in the last cycle of the election, was about 50 people. And some of those were all the ones that we prosecuted. There were some that we denied prosecution based on somebody, they weren't sure if their vote went through, you know, that kind of thing. So it happens a lot.
Could I extend that? What about interstate, like if you have a place in Florida, can you vote in Florida and Michigan too?
So typically you would have one place where you vote, and now you can vote electronically by mail, right? And so if you have a home in Florida, your main home is in Michigan, you would typically apply for absentee ballot, and you just send it in. You can send it in from Florida, and that happens a lot. So.
But I mean, the states don't merge their data. So
So-
how would you know if somebody did?
So we do.
Oh, good.
They can tell if Joe Brown votes, and he's got one social security number. And he's got, you know, we can tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you work with ACLU 1888 voice votes?
So we work with the ACLU a lot. As a matter of fact, during election period, they call the AG pretty regularly. And, you know, they get information, secondhand information sometimes, where recently, I remember they're telling us that people weren't allowed to vote in the last election, right? And we go to the polling place, that wasn't necessarily so, you know, because they're getting information from a citizen who is upset for whatever reason. They call it ACLU, and they're not necessarily getting firsthand information, so.
Those were the questions we had on cards. I don't know if anyone else had a follow-up question. Mary?
Could you respond to our new extended voting period? Are you going to have other duties to monitor drop boxes, and it's a 9 days? Are you gonna spread wings?
So what we did with the expanded voting period, right? We asked all the counties to set up cameras at their drop boxes. And I'll tell you, last year, our last voting period, we had a voting box that was set on fire, right? But that was just the one, it was a rarity, right? But what we asked is that they install cameras to watch the drop boxes. And I'll say 80% of them have cameras. But if there's an issue, talk to your local law enforcement or county sheriffs or state police. But also call the AG's office if there's a problem with a drop box.
So, during this has been so interesting, but I haven't heard the word your local clerk mentioned. So I'm assuming that the local, police and so forth get together regularly with the local clerks to tell them what's going on in their territory.
So Actually, this presentation, or something similar, a little larger, we do it every year with the local clerks. So we go to their annual, retreat, and so we do the same informational thing.
But I meant if something did happen in their city,
So
then
typically,
criminal stuff would be.
yep, so we're talking about criminal, right? So call your law enforcement, right? And so we work with Laura, who is the clerk, the president for the clerks union. And so we work with her regularly, and she gives us a lot of information, so.
I don't hope to monopolize, but along with my age, I've participated in a lot of elections, and I've been a worker handing out the literature, and I've always made an attempt to be friends with everybody, because that's where the conflict is. You have this person with a sign and this person, they're the ones that, because you walk up to vote, I have no idea how you're gonna vote, but it's the person who has the logo on and the sign, they tend to get into arguments.
Again, if they're following the rules, staying 100 feet away from the
Yeah.
polling place, there's nothing we can do about that. But once they come within that 100 feet, call local law enforcement, and they know exactly what they should be doing, all right?
In general, with all the new voting laws and all the mis and disinformation out there, do you see, are you prepared for a lot more problems? I know you already said you put cameras on block boxes, but there's a whole bunch of new rules going on, and who knows?
So that's a great comment, but part of the preparation for an election cycle, it just doesn't start at the election cycle. So we've been a part of conferences, all hands meetings and things of that nature with the clerk's office as they have began to prepare for the changes with the voting process. And what we also do, which we didn't really mention the detail on it, is we do also have training exercises throughout the year. And so those training exercises consist of all levels of law enforcement, clerk's office, cyber divisions, and we run through scenarios. We talk about what happens if this, what will we do if that? And so we do really have a lot of contingency discussions prior to the election actually taking place. And we do really try to run through almost any scenario, as wild as it can be, in those training exercises. And we hope, fingers crossed, that they won't actually occur. But if they do, we've had some discussion about it. We know who the contacts are, who we should be reaching out to if something happens with ballots or something goes down with power or things like that. We've discussed all of those possible scenarios and what we would do in response to them, including the changes to the election laws.
Okay.
Well, I want to give a big thank you to our speakers, to Aubrey, to Nishan, and to Emily. Really appreciate your perspective regarding the issues that we talked about. And thanks to all of you for all of your questions and the good discussion. And also, a big thank you to our Vice President, Karen Jones. She heads our advocacy committee, and Karen did a lot of hard work in working with Aubrey and our other speakers in getting this presentation together. So, Karen, please take a bow. So thank you, Karen. And again, thank you all for coming out this evening. Appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a good evening. We did have, before y'all go, we do have a number of different sign-in sheets here. We had signing in just for attendees, but we also have sign-in sheets or volunteer sheets if you're interested in some of our upcoming events. We have a trunk or treat and a track or treat going on, one in Dearborn Heights, one in Dearborn. We have, what's the other one, Jen?
We've got a general voter service committee sign up and an advocacy committee sign up and.
Voter registration.
Sorry, what was that?
Voter registration.
Registration.
Are we sponsoring the Henry Ford College on the 26th?
We can mention it.
Yeah.
So we've got a number of different sheets here regarding, some of you here are members, some of you aren't, and it's really nice to, hopefully you've enjoyed the event and maybe you want to get involved in some of the other things. Our advocacy committee does things like this event tonight, this educational event, where we bring in, guests with expertise to speak on these topics. So we have some sign-in sheets for that. Voter services, what many people think of when they think of League of Women Voters, getting out that information, our voter guides and things of that nature. We have some sign-in sheets, and if you want to get our newsletter, if you're not a member and you want to get our newsletter, please put an asterisk by your name in the sign-in sheet. And if you are a member or anybody here, we've got Dearborn Heights has some city council elections going on in November. So we have some voter guides that we've put together for the candidates who are running for city council. We have a big box there of paper guides if anyone wants to help us in distributing those to local places in Dearborn Heights to get that out for voters so they have that. Please stop and see me or Jen or anyone else. So anyone else have anything? Mary Jo?
Well, I was just gonna say, we also have lots of who's. I know there's some on the table, but if you have places where you know people gather, coffee shop, whatever, it tells who the elected officials are from top to bottom in Dearborn Heights, and Inkster. And also, we do have a pretty active website, so we try to put a lot of calendar events there and so forth, and advocacy things. So please take advantage of it. And there is, we do archive our newsletter that we send to supporters and members. And then we have one just for members.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Jo. And this is the who's who. Anyone who's here, if you maybe have your, somewhere where you go, a club or somewhere, and you want to take a stack of these, please do. This has every office from the president down to the local school board offices in Dearborn Heights, and Inkster. It has the name, the salary, the contact information. So it's a really good thing. And our league works hard to put that together. And then these bigger ones, some of you, I think maybe you're Dearborn residents, you looked at these and saw they were Dearborn Heights specific. But if anyone here is from Dearborn Heights, wants information on the council elections that are coming up in November in the Heights, these are the guides for that. So thanks again. Thanks, everyone.